Welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their leaders past, present and emerging. The Understanding Boys podcast is a series of conversations exploring what it is to be a good man these days. And if you had a story that you could tell a boy of, say, 14 and he'd listen, what would that story be? And that's really what I'm asking our guests today. I'm Dr. Ray Swan, and we're a community of teachers and parents concerned with the education and growth of boys and young men in the modern world. This series is brought to you by Brighton Grammar, an all-boys school in Melbourne. To learn more about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. In today's podcast, we speak with Hunter Johnson. Hunter's the CEO of Man Cave. It's a group that runs programs for boys ages 12 to 16. In our conversation, we have a broad chat about all things in his life, what led him to the work, but also some fantastic takeaways for parents about creating spaces, authentic and otherwise, for our kids to engage with. We talk about boys and their relational capabilities, and also how, for some, it's really difficult to find the words and the language to talk about what's going on. I hope you enjoy the conversation today. So joining us now is Hunter from the Man Cave. What a fantastic name, by the way, Hunter from the Man Cave. It's just awesome. You must get a few positive looks from that, from the boys that you work with.
Yeah, it's very funny, mate. Although I did have a guy from an advertising agency say to me, "Hey, mate, why is it called the Man Cave? It doesn't really feel like it's a man cave." And I had to reflect back to him, the advertising guy. If it was called the Feelings Cave, I don't think we'd get too many young men rocking up.
It's so true. And look, I mean, it is an interesting name, and I hadn't expected we'd go here first. But hey, we were just chatting off mic and saying let's just take it where it goes. And, the Man Cave, I mean, I guess it's as a trope and, cultural trope, we think of the Man Cave as a place that, that men disappear to do things that, they might be of personal, interest or, creative things working, traditionally, again, often machines and building stuff and all of that. But from your place, what is the Man Cave? What does it sort of mean, the work you do at a very high level?
Yeah, so when we thought of the name, 7 years ago now, it was really just what's a place that represents psychological safety to boys and men. And, we know notoriously the Man Cave has been somewhere that's the space where men can, it could be the tool shed, could be the games room, just could be a room that they hang out with their mates. And we just thought, well, particularly given the nature of where masculinity is up to, those things are still important, but we also need to create more range in our masculine identity. And what could it look like to create something that was named the Man Cave, which is a traditionally, pretty stoic, blokey environment, but also for that to include things like our emotions and our authenticity and our relationship skills. And again, I'm a big believer in meeting boys and men where they're at, using language that's accessible and relatable. And that's what made the most sense. And then the polished answer is a few years later, I re-stumbled across the old Joseph Campbell quote that the cave that you fear to enter holds the treasure that you seek. So
that's nice.
That was a nice little bow on top.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess in the work you do, going out, whether it's a school or community group and actually creating, I guess, the metaphor to me is it's creating safety, isn't it? That, such a key part of actually being able to let our guard down and be able to express ourselves and, through that start to connect to things that really do matter to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And, from all the schools that we've worked in, we are very intentional that when we meet the boys, we hold them outside the classroom and say, we're about to step into the Man Cave. This is a place where for the day, it's not school. It's a place where you can show up as who you really are. You'll probably find out a little bit more about yourself and the other people in the classroom, but you also have a choice. Are you going to step into this and play and be silly, which we can do? Or are we going to call you up into something higher? And that's who we're interested in meeting today, as well as having a bit of fun. So I think the psychological safety starts to be built as soon as boys hear the name, the man cave, and it becomes a blip on their radar, to the communication with the school and the parents. That's where all the enrollment starts to build. And then when our facilitators meet the boys for the first time outside the classroom, what's the energy they're in? What do they look like? How are they holding themselves? As well as when they enter the classroom, what's the energy there to create that different space? And really, as you know very well, Ray, it's how do you get them to feel safe in the room, respected, and then that they feel like they want to contribute, and it's a fluid conversation opposed to just speaking at them, which is much of the teenage experience.
Yeah, I think we can all resonate with that. And I want to ask you a little bit about, your life and your work. And, we've crossed paths a few times in various trainings, and, and again, for our listeners, please check out the Man Cave. We're going to talk about their impact report in our conversation today, but get on the website. And if you haven't, come across the work, it really is outstanding. And every time I hear anything that you guys are doing, it's always framed so positively. And I think part of it is what you just touched on, which is about this intention. You're just describing about who's going to show up today and what's that going to be like. And to me, at the heart of that, there's an invitation, and the invitation is, can I be my best self today? And that's an invitation that we have every day, I suppose. But, particularly for young boys, and whether it's culturally determined, I don't know, but that's such a powerful message, isn't it? Is, can you step into being real right now with your friends?
That's it. And I think it comes down to slowing the boys down. And often they're just in such autopilot with their existing culture and the group dynamics that they're in with their mateship group or their year group or their class group, that they often haven't slowed down enough to question the culture they're in, the social conditioning they've inherited, and then also how they are active participants in that, in policing others. And so I think for us, our whole mission is just, how do you create the space for boys where they feel safe and non-judged? And so that way we can actually have conversations around their unfiltered attitudes, their belief systems, their worldviews, and things that aren't politically correct, and just use those as the space to hear different perspectives and stories, with the idea that, the knowledge and the wisdom is often in the group. And so what we find is that when boys are given that space, which is so rare, that the authenticity just changes the room, that they just love and actively step into it. And so I think that's the real art of what we try to cultivate, is how do you just give them that embodied experience that it's okay to be themselves when there's so much conditioning around them that says, don't do that, you'll get kicked out of the group, which is, the teenager's worst nightmare.
Yeah, it's a fundamental part, isn't it, about all of us really, that we want to belong. And I think the other thing that you said, and maybe going back to the cave idea, is there's an invitation, I think, with what you set out when you first meet the boys as well, which is about coming, like a sense of honouring, or that there's something special about this right now, actually, that for all of the technology and for all of the life and everything that we see flashing by us, actually what is really special is actually what's here, it's what's in front of us right now. And I think, again, what you set out with that, with the way you described the way in which you guys work with kids is, and boys, is like, well, hang on, let's step into this. So I've got an expectation that we can show up, and there's something sacred about this, there's something really important. And that, I think it also underlines how important belonging is.
I love that. Yeah. And for me, it just makes me reflect on ritual, in a world where, we have so much profane time where it's just, from the next, we're joking about it before, going from the next Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting to, check my notifications, where you're just so on the hamster wheel. How do you create that sacred time, that deep time, that regenerative time where it just melts and you're entirely present? And, as a teenage boy, that's so rare to find. And I think what we do know about sacred time, which is just so a part of the human experience, the human condition, is that sacred time is renewal, it's reflection, but it's also very messy. And I think, when I think of the experiences that I've been in that are rituals, rites of passage, they're very raw, it's very messy. And I think what can happen now when we look to provide experiences, particularly for young people, whether it's a rite of passage or a ritual or a tradition, is they're very sanitized. But the beauty is in the mess, and the resiliency and the character development is in the mess. And so I think, even as we talk about school systems and private schools, and, I have no doubt you would have rubbed up against this at Brighton. It's like, how do you shape the character of these young men when there's so much around them that's like, I want to protect them, because the world is actually very unsafe in so many ways, but also the human experience is wildly resilient. So it's so tricky. How do you find those pockets of messy, regenerative, sacred time? And for us, that comes back to creating Man Cave. It's a different environment to school.
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk about your impact report today as well. And I noticed one of the things you did talk about was some of the challenges for teachers as well. And again, a lot of our people listening are parents and guardians, and they'd probably be listening thinking, yeah, great. So where does that sit? Where does that sit at the home? Because one of the competing tensions is actually, when I look at my teenage, unwashed, unruly, unkempt, messy boy, like I kind of want to put him in, and I need to give him some boundaries, and I need to help him form a relationship to rules and to structure, and not just to rebel. And these are some of the other things that as parents, that we really, really wrestle with. I wanted to take you back, if it's okay, just to talk a little bit about, your own story and, what led you to, to the work that you do. And it's been such a privilege for me, in interviewing people across these podcasts, is actually listening to, what leads them to an intersection of our lives, which is this podcast, and our listeners who are also sharing this with us. But, for you, and as I understand, in our conversations over the years, like, growing up, you're an athlete and you're injured, and there's challenges around that. I mean, can you just talk us through to the level which you're happy to? What were some of the things in your own formation as a young hunter that kind of led you to thinking, hang on, this is actually something for me in this that I think I can bring to the world?
Yeah, my parents, from very different angles, really shaped my upbringing. My dad was from a pretty tough background, and 1% of kids went to university where he came from, and my mum was from a kind of a conservative family, but was like the rebel against the conservative values. But they split when I was very young. But what I got was kind of two different worlds, whereas my dad was like, you got it pretty good, mate, never forget that. And, really was, encouraged me to forge my own path and to be my own person. And then, my mum was from a really entrepreneurial family, and, I was confused by the divorce, and, I look back on now with hindsight that, I developed some really constructive ways to deal with it, and also some really destructive ways to deal with it. And I think as I've matured, it's been kind of untangling myself from those behaviors or coping mechanisms. But I think for me, I went to a school in Sydney, a private boys' school called Knox, which I'm sure you're familiar with. The time I was at Knox we had a very masculine culture, and our year group particularly was very hyper masculine, which I loved. It fully suited who I was. It meant that I could get away with things because I was in all the top sport teams. It meant that I could live for the stories of the weekend, and I could share them with my mates at lunchtime. But at the same time, like I also knew it was a performance, and I didn't know how to get out of that identity. And things were really tough at home, where I'd just be having, fights with mum, where I remember one distinct fight when I was it would have been about 15, and some argument. I probably wanted to go to a party or something. And she literally stopped me and said, I love you, but I don't like you. And I remember like, to just cut through, and of course I didn't let her know about it. I think I told her for the very first time, and I've never said these words again. I told her to F off. And that was the scariest moment of my life. And I ran down the other end of the house.
I've met your mum a few times, and I can't imagine saying it to her. So
yeah, totally. I think she had letters in her hand, and she threw the letters at me, and they just fluttered. It was quite dramatic.
Yeah. Like a stage show almost.
Yeah, totally. And I just knew things I just couldn't keep going down that path. And then, I don't know if it's divine timing or pure luck or a bit of both, but I wanted to play professional rugby and then just had a massive injury on the field that was a really, really bad broken leg that ended up being about half an hour away from passing away. But it was a real crucible moment where I got left with a comment from my grandpa that said to me, you can be that, if you could be that good at sport, imagine if you could push that into something a little more meaningful.
Right.
It just gave me a chance to press refresh on my identity and really it's not like things changed overnight, but it was just that 5-degree nudge that opened up, me reflecting more on who I am, my character, my values. And I think that ultimately being surrounded by family who encouraged me to be myself led into exploring psychology and business, which then led down the path of the man cave.
Great. Just want to take you to where you were saying about the, you're in this high performing ecosystem, if you like, that supports a way of being, and you were saying how, because I think this is really key actually for a lot of guys, similar stories in some ways, going to school and being supported by an environment that ultimately I knew wasn't really healthy, but part of me actually really, found a home in it, and we're talking about, it seems to be a bit of a theme that's coming through, doesn't it, about finding a place and finding a home. And so, I would unpack a little bit more about that, because I think it's interesting how, were you conscious of these two worlds, at the time, the cost? I mean, it shared very eloquently about, crossing the line with your mum and, you knew that was wrong. And I'm sure you would have been aware of the costs of that. And at the same time, being supported by, yes, I can get away with things and I can do these things because, hey, I'm on the first 15 and, that's the way it is.
Yeah, I definitely was conscious of it, but I was petrified of it. And for me, all I wanted, now that I reflect back on with a bit of hindsight and I can dissociate from my experience a bit more, all I wanted to do was belong in my mates. But the culture of my mateship group was to be the alpha. And in order to be the alpha, it was continually reestablish ourselves at the top of the social hierarchy. And just the nature of, again, our group, which was very masculine, was find the most outrageous ways to do this. And often it was at the cost of our own values. And we were just so in it. We were so consumed by it. It was just what it was. And if anyone stepped out, you'd get some banter your way that would kind of police you to come back in. And, all we probably wanted to do was tell each other we really loved each other and we really respected our loyalty. And the other thing is, we got rewarded for that. We were such a successful sports team throughout the whole of high school. And so it's like you kind of got these contrasting messages coming in as a developing teenage brain who all, really want to just feel loved and that they're safe. And also the status that comes with it too. So it's really tough. How do you break that matrix is in a way that invite boys to more opposed to shame them or guilt them, I think is a real art.
Yeah, and I think that's something we will need to talk about is exactly that when we get into talking about the work that you do, because I actually think that a lot of boys know exactly what we're talking about. It's familiar, and I think a lot of the people listening will resonate, and I think it's a universal experience sometimes that you're in the wrong dance and you kind of, you can feel the rhythm of it and, you're taking the steps and it's kind of familiar and you don't want to fall out of that. And it does speak to leadership, doesn't it? At a broader, at a broader level, at a cultural level, whether it's at a political level, about what are who's actually setting this agenda, that's sort of been handed down. Because I think kids, and this would be an interesting question. I'd be very interested in your thoughts about this. I mean, kids can pretty accurately talk about what the rules of the game are, can't they?
Yeah, absolutely. They know. They also know who they should be, or are encouraged to be versus what is reality. In some of our very early on workshops, we get boys to just write down what does it mean to be a good man, and they write down all the things you can imagine: be honest, be kind, be reliable, be courageous. And then we get them to write down on Post-it notes, what does it mean to be a real man? What are you seeing around you? What's been role modeled? What's actually masculinity to you? And it's all the things that, we probably grew up saying ourselves, don't be a virgin, be ripped, sink a cold one with the boys, don't show fear, be in control, dominate. And it's like we have a conversation with the boys going, well, what do we see here? And it's the first time, because it's quite visual, we can have a really honest discussion around who's ever lived into those things, to be a real man that you're seeing, and what's the impact of it. And then suddenly that elicits the permission for boys to be authentic and vulnerable. And then that gives social proof to everybody else that it's okay to do that. And from that, we just have some incredible conversations where you see boys talk about, that they're not as developed physically as other boys and they get called gay. And they explain how that impacts them. And they've, for the first time ever, then we see boys who have just used that as banter because it's just what they do, step forward and apologize to those young men in front of their peer groups, which then also shows enormous character because they could easily sat on their hand. And then suddenly you've got a healing there, and the boy who, was getting bullied now feels accepted. The bullier gets a new lease on his identity too, and you create a new cultural norm in the group.
Yeah, and you're also in that moment, you're sort of reappropriating, a character strength like bravery. So bravery isn't about, taking the step where, you're cutting yourself off from, the emotional reality that you're experiencing. Bravery is actually stepping into the emotional reality and being honest about how you feel, and seeing that recognized. And how that truth drops is incredible, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh, as I'm sure you've seen many times, one of my favorite quotes about authenticity is it changes the particles in the room. And, the stories, when boys hear them, they just lean in, and it's way more powerful than TikTok. There's something about that, and that's something innate about our human experience that, like, someone's authentic story draws us in.
It is amazing, isn't it? I was talking to someone earlier this morning about boys who may appear to, and it might be something in this for parents, and we've covered it a couple of times in conversations, but actually having the courage to have genuine conversations, because kids really do show up. It's actually what they need. Like, it's sort of the mystery. It's like, oh, you actually really like doing this. Sometimes it's like, oh, you really want to have a real conversation with me. Wow. That obviously requires something from us, as parents, guardians, friends, teachers, facilitators, and so on. But there is a magic in it, isn't there, where you step into that space and you know what? Like, unless there's something else happening, kids will come in, and you'll have kids who appear completely dissociated from anything that's going on, not interested and rebellious, and you can put them in a room with a group of adult people who are speaking truth, and they'll just sit there and listen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think truth, it's
set you free.
It's, I love how many times we have to relearn that.
Yeah, it's painful.
Yes, yeah. Well, that area, for me, is truth and trust. I'm like, oh, great, I've got to trust myself in that area of my life too, not like all the others.
Yeah. And it's so true. It's something that, when the work that we do with parents, it's so much about that, because it's so humbling, as a parent, these lessons about, truth and trust, as you're saying, and the humbling where you sort of think you're doing everything right and you figure out, hang on, just, is it this kind of outside you thing, or is it actually you? Like, hello, wake up.
Yeah, totally.
Really humbling.
Yeah. And there's no rule book, right? And you would see this way more than me, but it's like each child has such a unique spirit, and it's, you talk about leadership. I think a parent is a pretty good crash course in leadership and, showing up yourself, because the reality is kids mimic what they see, not what is told to them. And so it's really that deeds, not words. And they're the moments that really, I think, shape character for young men particularly, is what they're exposed to, what are the values in action opposed to what's told to them. And if that's role modeling, speaking truth, if that's taking accountability for poor behavior as a parent, or if it's giving space for non-judgmental environments that can turn into teachable moments for young men, I think that's a real X factor as a parent.
It's great advice, and something really worth listeners thinking about. I completely agree. So back to your story, you've had these experiences, you're kind of heading out, you're studying, you're doing business, you're doing psychology, you're wanting to do something in the social space, starting up businesses and so on. Just, was there anything else that was catalytic in terms of like doing the work with boys?
Yeah, I started Man Cave with a guy called Jamin Heppel, and we just started to share stories about what our life was like as teenagers, and guys we know now, men that we know older than us. And for both of us, some of the most important men in our life had gone through years of mental illness, men that had raised us, but it was all silent. But then the other side of it, women who had raised us as well had started to share stories of their experiences with sexual abuse or harassment or misogyny. And we just started to question, why the systems that we have to deal with, whether it's mental illness or family violence, why are they geared around crisis management opposed to prevention? And why don't we just go upstream instead of downstream? And that was a real big thing for us. But it was just enough of a thread for us to pull on, and then the work just took over us. It's, as I'm sure you found even with this podcast, it's very altruistic. And I think I had to get to a point with the work where I realized probably a few years in that I was like, well, there's a lot of people in this space who I'm noticing are doing this for their own therapy. And I need to be really conscious, am I active in that too? And so that took some real kind of personal work and a lot of work with a psychologist and just moving through my own spectrum of trauma to really understand where was this coming from in me, and to then powerfully choose that I want to do Man Cave as service, not as therapy.
Mm. Yeah, it's so true. I could share many stories, as I'm sure you could as well, around that intersection of people's personal stories and the work they do. And I guess it's part of the vocational question, but there's a real important sense of ethics around that, and power and how it all sort of interplays, and where people are in those spaces. And I think something again with something like an impact report, or using your programs are evidence informed, having a bit of rigor around some of these things is also, we want the messy cave, but we also and there's not necessarily a rule book around around life, but there are guiding principles, and there are things, there's wisdom. And we know that these things are really important, and the who we are when we show up to be available is absolutely so important. And to me, it also speaks a lot about self-care. And, something I've been reading a lot more about in the last couple of years, someone who was on our we had a committee around positive masculinity and the work we were doing in that space, and really thinking about, who we can engage with. And Jenny is her name, and she's been a crisis counsellor for ages, and she's saying, I really think the boys really need to be looking at self-care and self-compassion. At the time, it was kind of coming in from a different angle, but then the more I've thought about it over the last few years, it's so true, because that self-care and taking care, because I think sometimes there's even a gendered thing about, self-care as a bloke, you sort of think, oh yeah, what am I going to start using moisturiser around? Come on. Self-care, another beer. There we go. That sort of stuff. But actually self-care is actually taking care. It's actually being responsible as well. It's managing your emotional wake. It's knowing how to being able to actually be angry but not scare people. These are things, we experience the gamut of emotions as humans, men and women, but self-care is actually it's not just about the soft stuff in terms of, I need to go and have a cry and I need to do these things. But it's also actually being about, being accountable and being responsible.
Absolutely agree. And I think, we only need to look at the fragmented healthcare system to understand the issue at play, even with the decisions that are being made about COVID. It's not taking into consideration our emotional or spiritual health. And because, whether that can be measured or not, and so I think, that real holistic education in a way that, meets boys where they're at is so important, because you're exactly right. If I talk, even for me personally, I go self-care, I just think of some Instagram.
People can't see this, but I can see the face you pull when you say that.
Well, it's, I also just say like Instagram's taken a hold of that. It's self-care is, another glass of wine,
it's
another
a market,
block of,
isn't it? Yeah.
Right. It becomes exactly marketing. But, I think the other really interesting thing inside of this is that it's like and this comes back to the patriarchy and hypermasculinity as well, is like there's almost been a demonization of the feminine, and as if the feminine is not necessarily girly things, but just feminine energy, which we all have in us at differing levels. Is there, like even spirituality is seen as a feminine pursuit that is now starting to become en masse, I think, more into the masculine identity. And I just think, like, why is it that taking care of ourselves is seen as feminine or girly? I just think that's a really interesting question that I'm also exploring as we move through the world with teenage boys.
Yeah, 100%. And I go back to, I've talked about this a few times in podcasts and the webinar recently, but the superhero image, this kind of loner, this unfeeling loner who kind of, and especially as superheroes now, they don't wear like the funky jocks on the outside of the tights, truth, justice, and the way. It's not like that. It's like waking up in the morning and sort of stumbling out of bed, and just maybe killing a few baddies on the way through as a sort of other sort of thing. It's so dystopian, the messages that kids get. So let's talk a little bit about your work in Man Cave, about the impact report. And, so you've entered this career, you've set up, with early days, huge rush. And again, for people who haven't followed, the trajectory of Man Cave and, the outreach, it's fantastic. It's fantastically profound. Like, it's great how, the kinds of exposure you're getting, to so many kids, and, hearing you speak in lots of different spaces. What are some of the things that you feel that the boys, are wrestling with? What are the more common? And I'm particularly interested in from when you started to now, like, maybe it's COVID, maybe it's other stuff, but what are some of the things that you reckon are really contemporary that the kids are experiencing?
Yeah, really, really contemporary is the lack of socialization into community, I think, is a real at present challenge. We ran because schools, as you know, have been open, closed. And, we ran a session recently with a bunch of boys, and they were just so quiet. And we were like, what is going on? Is this just a quiet group? And we just named it and explored it. And they said, no, we just feel way more comfortable speaking to each other online, which is really interesting, because there's two ways you can look at that. One is the short-term worry. But then if we zoom out of this, it's like, well, if this is their kind of way of dealing with the global world trauma, like, that's okay in the grand scheme of things. But also, that's, it is coming back to that, what you mentioned before, like, it is a really scary reality that we've intrinsically developed to belong in groups and share stories as groups, and, community is the answer. And now we're starting to see that take place in a digital forum, to the point where boys are resistant to socialize themselves in groups themselves. And also it gives them agency to create characters that they didn't get to create just from who they inherited that they are. I think that's something that I'm really curious, and that's just emerging now. Also, it's an incredibly confusing time for masculinity. Incredibly confusing time. The narratives which we're all familiar with, don't cry, be strong, be stoic, don't be a cis, don't be gay, which has been there since we were young. But then also now it's this kind of the flip of that. Be more emotional, cry more often, give up your power, your privilege, toxic masculinity, rape culture. It's all men, it's a lot to deal with. And the gender debate is very emotionally charged, and rightly so. But it's also a whole education source in and of itself to try and understand and move through. And then you've also got things like cancel culture. So how do you, if we're as men delicately stepping through this, how can you, as a teenage boy who've grown up in your life, which has been really hard and you've struggled relative to your own life story, how do you educate boys to be someone who actively is themselves, has great relationships and serves their community when they're being told you're bad or all men are bad or all the news stories in the paper are, around gangs and violence and Me Too. It's a lot for them to bear. And my experience, when boys, well, anyone really feels threatened, they go to attack because their identity is at play. And so what we see is that there's this silent resistance that's going on, but actually goes on all the way up to the boardrooms too, when there's conversations around quotas and, diversity and inclusion, and there's a real resistance there. And what we're seeing is there's boys having conversations themselves, but not feeling safe enough to have them in a public forum. And, we keep getting role modeled leadership like we're seeing in our highest office. And, that's what's the permission and the role modeling for boys. So, that's quite a long answer, but it just, I think, shows the complexities and the nuances of what does it mean to be a good man in 2021 and beyond. And I'm sure we'll go there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're hitting on, I think, is so key. And that is that, kids get a message, boys get a message about, their relational capabilities, not really welcome. Culture doesn't support it. So then they kind of go through this, and that's as young as ages 4 and 5. And so they embark on this journey where they don't really develop the skills and they don't name the emotions. They kind of have the polarity in their emotional experience. They don't really know how to regulate that well. They don't talk about it. And then they get thrust, they kind of press a button and they're thrust into the world of, 11 or 12, and they start seeing pornography and they start reading news and there's this huge download of just this, like you described, such complex, genuine, pain and trauma from so many different groups, and a lot of, a lot of it being, shown by men who haven't acted, with integrity and honor and great character. And so you're at that age, you're thinking, well, where do I go? Like, I don't really have the skills to talk it through. I kind of have the feelings. I got all these feelings. I got heaps of feelings, but where's the next step? And that's why these programs are so important, because they create a safe space. They create a little cave where they're welcomed. That's actually all about being honored, and that, it's important. It's a beautiful thing to connect to somebody else, to listen to somebody's story and to unpack, what you think. And this is why your work is so, so important. In your impact report, you talk about, and one of the, talk about, nuance and, the delicacy, and then there's the other side, and some things are just wrong, and, what we've seen, shared in Australia and, again, internationally about, things around consent and, respect and disrespect of women. And there's there's no nuance in what is right and wrong around that. But where the nuance comes in is actually, well, how do boys kind of unpack and talk about it? Like, how do they learn and in a safe way, and it's interesting, looking at your impact report and, a lot of boys are saying they know what consent means, but they need help to actually talk about it and to kind of think about different situations and what does it mean and how do I read it and what does, so yes, we know no means no. Like that's not the bit that's the issue. The bit is the enacted bit that you're at the party and everyone's been drinking, or how do we actually have preventative conversations to, as you say, to get upstream of these things so that we can actually have a culture that supports better ways of being for ultimately for men, but for boys as well.
Yeah, and I think as well, like the deliverer of the message is incredibly important. And, we often say the messenger is as important, if not more important than the message. And so we're really selective with our facilitators to represent a real diversity of masculinity, because coming back to what you shared around before around schools and teachers, oh my God, I have empathy for teachers. The reality of the schools.
I hear you, brother.
Yeah, as the tear drops down the face. Like schools are just
a little cry moment right now.
Yeah, exactly.
And share authentically.
That's right. The schools are the the education system, they're the role models, they're the counselors, there's the values and character development. It's, the tech department. It is just an entire infrastructure. And I just think parents can't outsource their child's moral and character development to a school. A school can support, absolutely, and they can help with the culture, but it starts at home. And I think that is just something which it just has to come back to that. Your family values. Who are you when no one's looking? What's the actions that your child is watching you consistently perform? And what accountability do you take for your role in the world and in your community? It comes down to that, which is hard when everyone's busy and, the world is going on in the way that it is. Absolutely. And also, we just have to come back to just taking the small steps.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems to be another theme that's come out of our chat is about taking care and taking that responsibility, and paying. And I think something else I'm really getting strongly from you is about, taking the time, slowing things down and paying attention to what matters is something else I'm really taking out of our conversation. So I have two questions that I always ask everyone, and we've kind of covered a little bit of, the first in terms of what is it to be a good man these days. But wow, man, you've lived this life where you every day, you're listening and you're talking, you're facilitating, you're in the, you're not playing on the rugby field, but you're playing, you're on the ground, you're doing things, you're passing the ball, you're doing what you need to do. So what is it to you to be a good man these days?
For me, I'm just so drawn to where the world is at, and it really comes down to service for me. And it's taking accountability for my actions, my behaviors, and also being responsible for what's the world I want to hand over to my grandkids. And so for me, that's like kind of the big, hairy, audacious goal. And then the actions, whatever they take place, I think I really just hope come from a really centered and values-driven place. And when I step out of that, which will happen, of course, I just am quick to move back to my own personal integrity and, being of service to people in my community and my family and my friends. The rest, I think, if I trust myself enough, often I have the answers. It's still on a big journey with that, as we talked about earlier.
Let me know when you get it right, mate.
yeah, exactly. But for me, it just comes back to just slowing down and asking my higher self, what's the next move?
And if you had a story that you could tell a 14-year-old and listen, what would the story be?
Well, the headline of the story is we can't hate somebody whose story we know. And so often what I find working with teenage boys is that there's like a real, as you get more than others, is the armor's up, the mask is on. It's, kind of, am I safe or not? But a particular story which just summarizes man cave for me, which is about a teenage boy, we're out in Lilydale. We got told about a boy who was the troublemaker. They were like, just send him out. And I remember rocking up into the classroom, and he's the only kid not in school uniform, rat's tailed down to his mouth. And, our facilitator kicked off the day and just yelled out as loud as he could, "This is gay." And in those moments, 50 boys, it was the final day of the year as well, which is also always chaos. It was like a zoo. And, the crowd erupted, and our facilitator, Josh, actually got called gay when he was at high school. And so that was a little bit of a moment where he had a bit of a flashback. Also his first day on the job with us. And I just jumped in and just said, my guess is you've got a bit of a reputation. And he's just sitting there, his arms crossed, just going, maybe. And I said, well, here's the thing, dude. I know guys like you have enormous leadership potential, and you mostly just use that for entertainment purposes. And that probably works for you. But today I'm going to give you a chance to flex that muscle in a completely different direction. In fact, who'd like to see that 49 hands go up? And I said, well, there's your invitation, pal.
Yeah.
And I just moved swiftly on. And as the day continued to move through, we ran a session called If You Really Knew Me, You Would Know, where boys get the space to share something that is important to them, that they've always wanted to share, that they're proud of. And I've kind of framed it up and to your point earlier, just said, who's the bravest in the room? And we'd obviously set it up. It was challenged by choice. There was a group agreement in place. And I saw his hand shoot up and he goes, I'll go. I'm like, okay, cool. And he opened up about his story. You know, he lost his dad. He was 14 in year 8, lost his dad a year ago to suicide, was having troubles at home, started smoking a bit of weed. That led on to some heavier drugs, started getting more fights with his mum. His mum kicked him out of home, was living under a bridge in Lilydale, and eventually got in a fight with his dealer and then got taken to juvie. And at juvie, his mum came in. At juvie, they gave him pills for his anxiety. And then his anxiety pills started to make him really agitated. So they gave him pills for his ADHD. And suddenly, after a couple of weeks, his mum came and got him out and put him into rehab, but a real positive rehab. And he'd just come back to school after 6 months to get his education back. And this is a 14-year-old boy. And he shared this story for the first time ever with his best mate next to him, with his best mate's arm around him, tear dropping from, I'm just feeling it now actually, tear dropping from his best mate's face, and his best mate going, I didn't know that about you, but that's why you're my mate. And then you just look, there's just a pin drop moment with the group. And, I said, how are you feeling, mate? And he goes, I feel a bit nervous. I'm like, why you feel nervous? He's like, well, I've always wanted to share that, but I just haven't known how to. And I said, who's got enormous respect for right now? All the hands go up. I said, what do you respect about it? And the first kid goes, yeah, mate, like I thought I was going through a bit of stuff with my parents getting divorced, but yeah, I just massive respect to you. And it was just like they were just popping off. Yeah. And you look back, it just looks like a different human being. And then we look back at the teachers whose mouths are just, jaws are on the ground. And it was just such an example for, not judging the behavior, but seeing the person. And so, we stayed in contact with him, and, he's in leadership positions at that school. And, it's just such a great example of when given that space, boys absolutely show up. And also, just the power of story. When we hear someone's story, it all suddenly makes sense.
It's a fantastic place to end our conversation. Hunter, thank you so much for your time. And, I know on behalf of listeners who will just be, I think, blown away by who you are, your story, your life story, the work, reaching thousands and thousands of boys, across Australia, and even more broadly now that Man Cave's gone global. It knows no bounds, the cave. We'll leave the metaphor. We'll start it with the metaphor. We probably won't go into it. We won't riff on it too much. But on behalf of everyone here at Understanding Boys, thanks again for your time, and encourage everybody just to jump on the website. They've got fantastic resources. Read the impact report. They've got TV. They've got all sorts of things that are designed, to help you in your journey, whatever your journey and however your intersection with us has been today. Thanks again, Hunter. We hope you've enjoyed this Understanding Boys podcast. Make sure you subscribe on your podcast app, and please leave us a review to help grow the community. For more information about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.